Chapter 10 focuses on assessment, and we won't go into too much detail on Chapter 10 and assessment just because we've covered assessment types of assessment with every chapter we've covered in both ED 321 and ED 322. So keep that in mind as I make this chapter a little bit briefer. But there are 6 principles of reading assessment that we want to keep in mind. So as you're thinking about the types of assessment, whether you're looking for or creating assessment or thinking about the whole process and how you do it in your classroom, keep these 6 principles in mind. 1, assessment informs instruction. Okay, if you grade a test and you don't use that information to inform your instruction, then you just wasted it. Especially if you have kids who missed certain items or didn't do well. Did you go back and look to see what they were struggling at and use that to guide your instruction for the week or the interventions you might provide? You need to use that information. I struggled with this the first few years in teaching to actually use my assessment to inform my instruction, especially because you have that scope and sequence, or you get a sequence chart from your district and they tell you what you've got to be covering and when you've got to be covering it, and there's no room to slow down. Well, at the end of the day, I had to get my students where, on the level they needed to be on, and so I would have to use the assessment even if it meant I wasn't quite where my district always wanted me to be. So I tried my best to differentiate instruction and meet their needs, and assessment gives you a great look at what you need to be teaching the next week. Principle number 2, assessment procedures should help teachers discover what children can do, not just what they cannot. So we also need to know our students' strengths and use those to their advantage. And even if they're strong in something, don't keep reteaching it. Don't make it the independent practice all the time. They've already mastered it. Let's move on and teach them something new. So keep in mind that assessment also needs to show you what the children can do, not just worrying about what they can't do. And then principle number 3, every assessment procedure should have a specific purpose, okay? Don't give a test just to give a test because it's Friday and that's the day you test every week. You need to have a reason, and whatever you've created or whatever test you've chosen needs to be assessing for a specific purpose, whether it's the end of the unit or a skill you've been teaching for a while and they should be proficient at it. And then number 4, classroom assessment should be linked to core standards. We have the Common Core standards that we have chosen to follow as a state, and you need to be linking your assessment to that. If you have a core reading program and the assessment doesn't seem to be linked to the standards, or it's assessing things that aren't even taught on that grade level, you need to keep that in mind and possibly even create new assessments. And then principle number 5, assessment strategies should not supplant instruction. Assessing does not take the place of teaching it, okay? Often I've seen assessments on skills that were barely mentioned in class and not even taught. And they used, and I'm talking about tests, but often we have worksheets, we have fill in the blank, different types of activities we take grades on or record, and we use it thinking we're teaching the skill and we're going to grade it, but we really haven't even taught the skill. All we did was show them how or tell them how to do the worksheet. So we need to keep in mind that whatever assessment strategy we may be using and whatever assessment we want to come out of that, as far as like assessing, say your benchmarks, your objectives, that shouldn't take the place of the actual instruction. It needs to be taught. There needs to be some modeling, some guided practice before you actually, take that and look at the assessment and potentially record a grade for it. Now, there are plenty of informal assessment as well, so keep that in mind, but we need to be cautious. And then principle number 6, effective classroom assessment makes use of valid and reliable instruments. We need to make sure, I know we create some of our own assessments, but we need to be aware of the types of assessments that we create and whether or not it's quality. And if you're looking, for instance, a core reading program, you want to make sure that the instruments they use are valid and reliable. I've given an assessment sometime or pulled up, say, a math assessment even, and started to give it and thought, this doesn't even assess what we taught this week, or it's on a different level. It's assessing on a higher level, and I didn't teach on that level. And so I've had to recreate assessments quite often because I didn't teach on the same level as the assessment. Now, 4 purposes of reading assessment, things that you want. You have outcome assessments. These often survey the reading achievement of the entire class. So, how's your teaching? How are you doing as a teacher? How's your class doing as a whole? There's also screening assessments, which provides initial information about students. These are ones you'd often use at the beginning of the school year, or if you have a student who just came into your classroom, it just gives you an idea of how to group them, where to put them, where to start. And then you have your diagnostic assessments, and those give more in-depth information. You might even be getting into running records and some of the phonemic awareness, phonics assessments, but they give you specific strengths and needs of the students. And then, of course, there's progress monitoring assessments that give you that ongoing feedback on how well they're doing overall. Are they gaining in fluency, for instance? You could assess fluency every few weeks or once a month and see if they're making gains. Okay, so that's more of a progress monitoring type of assessment. Now, appropriate assessments for each RTI level. When you're looking at Tier 1, the core classroom instruction, this is the majority of your students. You've got your screening assessments you're going to do at the beginning of the year. You'll do progress monitoring throughout the year. How are they doing? Dibbles often becomes progress monitoring because you do it several times a year. And then outcome assessments, as a whole, at the end of a unit, at the end of 9 weeks, what are you giving to see how the whole class is? That's what you're giving for your whole class typically. And then there's this Tier 2 supplemental intervention and Tier 3 intensive intervention. With those, you're going to do more diagnostic assessments to give you details on what type of interventions that child needs. You'll still need the progress monitoring to make sure that they are coming along. You don't want to keep teaching something they've already mastered. So keep that in mind. Progress monitoring can also work for that, not just to see what they haven't mastered. And then, of course, those outcome assessments will continue. Excuse me. Now, other screening and progress monitoring assessments, of course, we know kid watching, teacher observation, paying attention to those details. We can also look at their reading interests, their self-perceptions, how well do they think they do, the attitude interest inventories. Those are important because when you're interning, you will usually want to do some type of interest inventory just to give you guidance in how to motivate your students throughout that year. Whether you got young kids or older kids, an interest inventory is always useful. There are self-rating scales for subject area reading. How well do they think they're using certain skills? Are they following rules? If they come to something they don't know, are they doing this, and this? So self-rating scales also help students to monitor their own learning. There's assessing background knowledge, like if you want to do a pre-test. You could even do a word map on what they know about a certain topic and let them brainstorm things. That gives you an idea of what they knew before. So that gives you that background knowledge. That is very important before starting a chapter. Often when we do units, for instance, on, say, space or something, well, they've already covered it in another grade, or they're already proficient on certain things. So it's important to know that background knowledge before you spend a month teaching something they're already familiar with. And then, of course, family surveys of reading habits. Often schools at the beginning of the school year will send home family surveys. It helps to know whether or not their parents do homework with them, read with them at home, or do they work more on alphabet, phonics skills, okay? So those can be very useful. And, of course, screening checklists and scales are important. If you can check off and look quickly at what a child can do or knows already, it gives you a quick look at and being able to place them or a specific need. It's a very useful idea as well. And then, of course, assessing students' reading of nonfiction text. We want to keep in mind that they're being tested not only on fiction text but nonfiction. So when we're assessing, we need to think about nonfiction text. Even if it's in your social studies book or your science book, that's nonfiction, and we need to think about the reading concept there. And, of course, published reading tests are out there that you can find. We kind of talked about Marie Clay and how you have to pay for those. So there's a lot of different types of screening and assessments that are out there that you'll have to pay for. Some of the informal reading inventories, and these are great. To me, they give you a good bit of diagnostic information as well. But the comprehensive reading inventory is really good, developmental reading assessment, and I've used, I think, the critical reading inventory. You can even go to Barnes & Noble sometimes and find an informal reading inventory, but it is helpful to keep one in your classroom. And, of course, curriculum-based measurement that's out there. There are many different types, so your book will give you a few details on that. Now, outcome assessments that we're looking at, and I mentioned progress monitoring. DIBELS is an outcome assessment. You can kind of look at your class as a whole. How did they do on certain things? You can compare them all. Dibbles is good. Like I said, you give several times a year. It's brief. It's fairly easy. TPRI, Texas Primary Reading Inventory, is very well detailed, excellent. But the issue with TPRI sometimes is that it takes a lot of teacher classroom time. So we've often gone with Dibbles instead. Now, diagnostic assessments that are out there, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test is really good to get an idea of what their vocabulary capabilities are. There's a couple others, the Woodcock, I can't even pronounce that one, so I won't even try, but that one's important. The one that's really important is the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test Revised. It is a diagnostic test that is individual to a student's needs, and it gives you specific details. Now, often when you're giving these, it's somebody who's been trained for these, so it's typically not you, the classroom teacher, giving some of these. But the Peabody and the Woodcock are two very popular ones that are used. Now, when you're doing this and you have this information, you want to create a profile. If you're assessing your students, remember you need profiles. If you get state test scores back, you want to create student and class profiles. So your student profile, it includes those observations about the degree to which a student demonstrates a specific skill. You might include what they mastered or what they struggled with from state testing in the class. And then even your class as a whole, because you can look at different objectives and which students need to work on those objectives. So you want to create a class profile as well as a student profile. Now, the concept of if-then thinking. If you have identified specific learning needs in reading for a student, then which reading skill and strategies are appropriate to offer the students next in your classroom instruction? So if they know this, then what am I going to do about it, okay? Where do we go from there? So when you're looking at assessment and how the students are doing and the information you got, you look at it and you go, okay, so if they're here, if they know this, then what am I going to do? What do we do next? So you need that if-then style of thinking in your classroom when dealing with assessment, and that is Chapter 10.